Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we're going to do another question and answer series, or I should say a session. These questions keep coming in, and they're very good. And on this particular session, I think probably I'll only deal with one, and it might even take even two sessions. We'll see how it goes because there's so much. The question is, does archaeology prove that the Bible is true? Well, this question right off the bat requires that we define two terms. One is archaeology, and the other is truth. Let's give it a shot. Archaeology is simply the study of material remains in any given period of human occupation. It can be relatively recent. You can do archaeology of a site that is 100 years old or 200 years old or 500 years old, or you can do archaeology in the ancient world. When you and I think of archaeology, we typically are thinking about so-called biblical archaeology, the archaeology that deals with the time of Israel and the famous biblical sites, or in the New Testament period and that sort of thing. So it could be as recently as 100 years old. It can be as old as 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, or even longer than that. Of course, when we're dealing with the Bible and archaeology, we are talking about ancient Near Eastern archaeology in general and ancient Israel in particular. And you need to know that archaeology in the ancient Near East, and especially Israel, is nothing short of a cottage industry. There are an awful lot of archaeologists out there. Now, these material remains that an archaeologist looks for are all material remains that are the result of human activity. In other words, these are people who are trying to find out, what did people build? What kinds of houses did they build? What kinds of buildings did they build? Were they large? Were they small? What kinds of temples did they build? What kinds of palaces? How did they plat out a city or a town or a settlement? How did they dig wells? All sorts of structures which are always have a human being or human beings doing them are the heart of archaeology. An archaeologist wants to find out what kinds of tools did people make and use, and what were they made of? Were they stone? Were they bronze? Were they iron? Very often, the material, the tools from which the tools were made of materials that give the name to the particular archaeological period. For example, from 1400 to 1200 is considered the late Bronze Age, and then after that you get to the Middle Bronze Age. And then after that, you get in the early Iron Age and that sort of thing. I'm sorry, late Bronze and then early Iron, because of the different materials that are used. Of course, stone implements are from the Stone Age, and that would typically mean in prehistoric times, because by the time you get written materials about 5,000 years ago, human beings have gone well beyond using stone. And the archaeologist wants to know what sorts of utensils or pottery, how was that made? Of how was it fired? How did you make it durable? How about clothing? Did they make looms? Were there any parts of looms that are actually discovered? Because very often they are made from materials that would not last over time. Now, all of these material remains have to be interpreted with the help of documentation And for many, many, many of these things, we do not have any written documentation. As well, how do you date this material? Let's say you find a house in a particular archaeological site, you have to figure out what time that house was built, what was under it and what was on top of it, because human beings had a way of building and building and building, and they would simply keep building on top of stuff that had already been built. There's a Hebrew word, tel, T-E-L, as in Tel Aviv. It's spelled slightly differently in Arabic, and it means a mound or a hill. And the reason you have all of these tells or mounds is because human beings over time, over hundreds and thousands of years, actually raised the levels of the ground on which they were living, because buildings would collapse, and you would, instead of excavating and going down to the bottom, you would just simply build up on that. So very often you would have layers. Perhaps you're digging on a site and it had been occupied for maybe 400 or 500 years. Well, the earlier years, you're going to have to date that very, very different from the later years. And sometimes the tools will tell you that. Sometimes the pottery will tell you that. And sometimes it's very, very difficult. Dating is often very controversial. And there are many, many debates as to how what particular period a particular archaeological site tells about. Now, we'll come back to some of these things in a minute. But now let's talk about, the question was, does archaeology prove that the Bible is true? Well, that's going to require us to talk about what it means to be true. Now, typically, when that question is asked, that's another way of saying, is the Bible historical? That is to say, are the people mentioned in the Bible real people? Did they do what the Bible says they did? Did they say what the Bible says that they said? And so typically when you're saying, does the archaeology prove of the Bible, you're saying, does archaeology prove that the Bible is historical, or does the Bible, contrarily, prove that the Bible is untrue? Now, let's talk about the whole issue of history or truth. Both history and science are the most important principles, or the most principal offshoots of what we call the Enlightenment, the sort of the Renaissance, because at that time people began to think that truth has to be determined not by tradition, not by a religion, not even by philosophy, but by either science or history. And early on, it was believed that both of those were so completely objective that if something was scientific, it would trump anything religious, it would trump anything philosophical, it would trump anything aesthetic, it would trump anything moral, because science was seen to be as objective truth. And history was not far behind. Early on, it was believed that we need to think of the past in terms of what we can document, and documentation requires written materials. Now, right off the bat, that's a problem, because human beings have been around, let's say, just for the sake of the argument, at least or close to 100,000 years, but writing only goes back about 5,000 years. So we only have about 5,000 of the last 100,000 years that we have any documentation of any kind that a historian can try to piece together what people said, what people did, what they thought, and that sort of thing. So most of human history is basically prehistorical. And we can make some guesses. We can make some very, very educated hunches, but we can't have documentation because we don't have anything, because writing was only invented by 5,000 years ago in the two river valleys. Almost simultaneously, writing appears in the Egyptian Nile area and in the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. So from that time on, we have documentation, although in the early periods, even that is quite spotty, it's quite sparse, and so we can only do the best we can. But in any case, from the Enlightenment, let's say maybe 200, 250 years ago, we have come to believe that both science and history are objective disciplines. Now, most recently, at least in the 20th century, scholars realize that we oversold those things. Science is absolutely marvelous, and science has done incredible things, and science deserves all of the reputation it gets because it has been pretty spectacular in terms of what it produces. But there are so many things that are important to what it means to be a human being that science has nothing to say about. A scientist cannot tell you what is beautiful or what is ugly. A scientist cannot tell you what is good or what is bad. A scientist can't tell you about love or hate. And those are very, very crucial things to human beings as they try to make meanings and that sort of thing. So science is wonderful in dealing with the material world and understanding that material world, and we continue to be astounded by almost every day with amazing new discoveries, either of outer space or, for that matter, inner space. And so science has to be greatly respected, but it is not the final arbiter of all truth. The same thing has to do with history. Early on, it was believed that when you wrote history, you were supposed to write the past as it actually happened. As it actually happened. Well, no one ever can do that. You can never write history about something that actually happened because history is way too contingent, way too complex. When you write history, it's mostly what you're leaving out rather than what you are putting in. In any case, let's deal with this business of science and history as being the final arbiters of truth. Now, again, I want to say that I was trained as a historian. I have great respect for history. I'm not a scientist, but I have great respect for science. It is, however, even though it is an element truth that science leads us to truth and history leads us to truth, it's an overstatement or an overreach to say that they are the final arbiters of everything that is true. So let's talk a little bit about history. First of all, history requires documentation. Without the invention of writing, there's no history. Unless human beings have a way of writing something down and recording something, you have no idea what they thought, what they believed, what they found meaning in, and that sort of thing. Now, we have great documentation for the last 5,000 years, certainly the last 4,000 or 3,500 years, although the very fact that you have to have many histories, and the work of history is never done, shows the complexity of the issue. History is always perspectival. In other words, you're always going to have the point of view of the historian. And that's why there are countless histories, for example, of the life of Abraham Lincoln. There are countless histories of World War I or World War II. There are countless histories of the presidency of John Kennedy or the presidency of Richard Nixon. There will be many historians who will tell you about the presidency of Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, and they will differ depending on who is doing the writing, even though they will have access to the same documentation. As well, history is always telescoped. History always leaves out so much more than it leaves in. Let's think of history in this sense. History is, in one way, the sum total of human experience. It's what every human being has ever done and ever said ever since there have been human beings on this earth. Now, no one could write that history, and no one could read that history. That is a history that is known only to God. So the human histories that we actually do have is always abbreviated, summarizing, condensing, and it depends on what the historian chooses. And it is always interpretive. And that's why you could not even get unanimity among historians for something as recently as when George Bush had the United States attack Iraq. You're going to get very different points of view depending on the point of view of the historian, even though that is well documented. For that matter, we watch the thing on television. So it's not a matter of documentation, it's a matter of perspective. I like to use this example. I like to hang out in half-price books in Seattle and in Kirkland. It's a fun place to be, and I'm kind of a little bit of a buff of World War II, so I like to hang out and see what's been written. And of course, there are countless volumes on World War II, so many that if I read one each day for the rest of my life, I would not even put a dent into it. Now, let's say you get a really fat volume, maybe 2,000 pages of World War II, and that would be a very substantial tome. Here's what's interesting. Let's, just for the sake of the point I'm trying to make, let's say that the World War II began in 1939 and ended in 1945. Now, right off the bat, I can hear someone say, wait a minute, we have to talk about how Hitler started to come to power in the 20s and the early 30s. That's quite true. And World War II went right into the Cold War, and we might be revising that as we speak because of the recent attack on Ukraine by the Russians. But for now, for the point I want to make, I want to talk about the 6 years, 1939 to 1945. Now, that was a world war. Now, what that means is that in those 6 years, hundreds of millions of people did things and said things. No 2,000 page volume would even come close to what those millions and millions and millions, hundreds of millions for that matter, did or said. So you're going to have to condense and abbreviate and turn the telescope backwards so that you zero in on this particular phase of the war, because you cannot say everything. Now, you can do a very credible account. You can do a very good piece of work, but you're never going to say that the material is just simply, that's what happened. I mean, the histories are going to talk about generals and presidents and prime ministers and large armies, and you're very seldom going to talk about a particular infantryman. That's what made the movie Saving Private Ryan was interesting, because it focused on one single family that had lost 3 sons to the war. And And that was a very effective piece. But again, that's always you're mostly leaving things out. So history is very, very complex. Now, when it comes to the Bible, here's how I would put this, and I think I already know that I'm going to need another session to do this. The Bible is historical in this sense. The God of the Bible is described as acting in human history. I mean, the whole thing about the incarnation, you cannot be more involved in history than Jesus of Nazareth, an ordinary human being. And God is always involved in people's lives, in the people Israel. That's all part of the Bible. So the Bible is certainly oriented to history. But that's very, very different from saying that the Bible is without remainder history, in the sense that everything that everyone that is mentioned was a real character and did exactly what the text says. Now, how do I know that? Well, I do not know that from the Bible itself. Let me give you two examples, and then I'll save the rest of the material for the next session. There are two major stories about Israel in the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. The main one, and the one we know best, is the one that we find in the books of Samuel and Kings. It starts with the beginnings of Israel. Actually, the beginnings in Joshua, where they take the land, and Judges as they try to settle the land. And then in 1 Samuel, you get the rise of the monarchy. And when you get into 1 Kings and 2 Kings, you have the stories of the two monarchies after Israel is divided into north and south. And then, of course, the people go into exile. But there's another story of Israel, one that we don't know as well, and that is in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Both of those stories are perspectival. Chronicles tells the story in a very, very different way. That story, that is in the Chronicles, has a completely different perspective on Israel, and for that matter, on really some famous people. David doesn't do anything wrong in Chronicles. There's no story with sinning with Bathsheba or murdering Uriah or that sort of thing. But when the community of faith said, this is Bible, they didn't say, well, we've got two stories. In some ways, they contradict each other. Let's decide which one we like, and we'll put that in the Bible. Both of them are put there. And that means we need to read them dialogically. We have to read them comparatively and read them in that manner. The same thing for the New Testament. There's only one Jesus, but there are 4 Gospels. And the Gospels are very different. 2 of them, Matthew and Luke, have nativity stories. 2 of them do not. Mark has no nativity story, and the Gospel of John doesn't worry about the nativity. It starts in the very beginning, just as the Old Testament does. In fact, the first words in the book of John is verbatim the first words of the Old Testament in its Greek version, NRK in the beginning. But those 4 Gospels tell the story of Jesus in a different way. And there are even some ways that are contradictory. I'll talk about that next time. So, in terms of does archaeology prove the Bible that is true or not, you're going to have to wait next week to see what I have to say about that. Once again, let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know your email so that I can contact you for my mini courses. And as I said last time, they are coming. I'm learning the techniques that I'm going to need to be able to do that. I think you're going to like it, and we'll go from there. And also send me any of your questions at fspina1 bible106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.